Susan has a long and varied experience as a teacher and a teacher trainer, magazine editor, publisher, and author, including the Portfolio series and One to Four, both Macmillan do Brasil.
Oi,
She's now
Márcia.
based in
Márcia?
Yes. Is everything okay? She is now based in Scotland, where she runs a small publishing and materials development company. She has worked with colleagues in Brazil over the last 20 years, and she is delighted to be back again. With you, Susan Holden. Welcome, Susan. Thank you for being here today with us.
Thank you, Marcia. And it's lovely to see you and be able to talk over distance. It's a real pleasure to participate in this series of SBS webinars. I first came into contact with SBS, I think it was 30 years ago, not 20 years ago. And since then, SBS has grown, has developed. And now the word SBS also is linked with education. And I think that is just so important because we all need education. And so within the context, the wider context of education, we've got this series of webinars over this 2.5 days. And I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person, but it's very good to be able to communicate at least online. And we just hope it all works. Because as Marcia said, I'm talking to you from Scotland on the other part of the world. I'm going to be talking about teaching English today, and that's a title which, you know, nothing special about it. Happens to be the title of a book, but nothing special about that. But the actual meaning of those words, especially the word today, has, I think, changed a lot. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So there are quite a lot of slides, which I'm going to go through. I'm using the slides as background to some of the things I'm talking about. And the way I've decided to structure this, because of the amount of time we've got and because of the number of participants, I decided to pose questions to you. And these are questions where I won't be able to get the answers immediately in the way that I would in a live workshop. But I hope they're the kind of questions that you can think about for yourselves. If you're involved in training teachers, you might like to use them with your trainees. And also, if you're working with other colleagues, you might like to discuss them with colleagues. So the questions are there really just to make us think and focus on things. So if we go to the slides now, if that's possible. When I first thought about this, teaching English today, okay, adapting to change seems a pretty obvious subtitle to give it. But we're now on the 30th of July, 2020. And what we actually mean by adapting to change has itself changed quite a lot, because something has happened in the world that is, I'm sure, affecting you in Brazil, Peru, wherever else you are, in exactly the same way that it's affecting me in Scotland. This awful thing called Covid-19. And before Covid-19 happened, we all had to adapt to change. The weather changed, politics changed, job changes, family changes. In our lives as normal people, as well as teachers, as perfectly normal people, we were adapting to change every day. And I'll give you some examples from my own experience. As Marcia said, I live in Scotland. That's a photograph I took in, I think, the end of February or early March, from just outside my house. Very typical Scottish view, a river, a little mountain with a bit of snow on it and so on. And then suddenly in that day, it started snowing. and that was my garden with the snow coming. And changes in weather, you don't have exactly these changes in Brazil, but changes in weather like this, we're all used to. We adapt, we change our clothes, we change our daily program and so on. We feel miserable. If the sun comes out, we think, oh, it's not so bad. And we feel cheerful again. And then we think of the practical things that have come out of the snow. In my case, having to take snow off the car before I can get out of the drive and go and do something or go and do some teaching. So outside forces have huge effects on us in our ordinary everyday lives. But 3-4 months ago, something happened which I think is changing all our lives. And that's something that has produced these kind of signs in our streets. These are some photographs that I took in the little town where I live. I went out with my camera last week and I took photographs of some signs that wouldn't have been there 4 or 5 months ago. And this mask, I'm sure you all have them too, this has become part of one's everyday equipment. So that is a huge, huge change that has happened in the last 3 or 4 months. And so I felt that the better subtitle was not adapting to change, but thinking about teaching English today before, during, and after COVID-19. And as well as signs about masks, we're seeing signs about social distancing everywhere. Now, I don't think, as a native English speaker, I don't think I had ever heard that phrase, social distancing, before March. And yet suddenly it's everywhere. You hear it on the radio, you hear it on television, and you see it in signs on the street. So even the use of language and the actual language that is being used is changing because of the COVID-19. And this is something that is interesting, but it's something to take note of. What I want to do is think about 4 different aspects of teaching English today, the contexts in which we're both living and working in today, how the context is the same or different from before or after COVID, the effects it's having on our teaching and students' learning objectives, maybe our own learning objectives, and looking ahead, what sort of things are going to change. So going back to today, I think we need to think about our surroundings. I've shown you some photographs of my surroundings, and I've shown you some signs from the main street, the high street in my little town. Those have changed. Have people changed? I notice when I walk, we are allowed to go out of our houses now, but we're meant to keep 2 meters distance from people. And I notice if I pass somebody in the street, some people look quite nervous. I don't know if they're nervous particularly of me, but they sort of give you a funny look. And so our behavior, our relationships with people is actually changing at the moment. As teachers and learners, what are the contexts and the ELT context? Are you able to go and teach a live class? I imagine not. Certainly can't happen here. Therefore, are you having to teach online? Is this something that you ever thought you'd be doing? Is it something that you adapted to naturally? Or is it something you struggle with? And similarly, what about your learners? If you're teaching children, if you're teaching young children, are they missing the fact that they can't be with their friends, that they're separated? And you may do lovely things with them online, but it's not quite the same as being in a live class. And resources. What kind of resources do you have now at the moment to teach with? Are you only reliant on the internet? And if so, how have you adapted to it? And how are all these things affecting your objectives in teaching? This is another photograph I took. We have a small supermarket in the town, a co-op, co-ops in most towns in most countries of the world. And this was a sign I found quite useful and interesting in terms of language. They want to get over a message to people who are going to shop in that small supermarket. We have a one-way system in place. Please stay safe, follow the arrows, and maintain, and again this phrase, social distancing. Very important message to get over so that people are not getting too close to each other when they're shopping. So I think as a question for you to think about and maybe discuss with colleagues is, what is your ELT context today? Is it your kitchen table? Is it a special room in your house where you can communicate with your learners and with colleagues? And how different is it from how it was before when you were in a classroom live with live people, both students and colleagues? So thinking about the context in which we're teaching is important, because obviously the context has an effect on our behavior. There are some things that you can do wonderfully. You know, I can be sitting here in Scotland talking to you, but I can't see you. I don't know how you're reacting. I can't see the facial expressions, which in a live situation, in a workshop, like in a normal class, one can. So the context has a great effect on what we do and how we do it. I'm talking far more than I would if we were in a live situation. And you may find that you're doing exactly the same with your students if you're teaching online. Again, thinking before and after, it's worth reflecting about these things in relation to how you did things before COVID and how you think you might do them in the future, because these are going to shape your objectives. And I think when we're teaching, it's very, very important that we have very clear objectives. We know what we want to do. Do your students have clear objectives too? Do they know what they want to learn, what they want to be able to do? Because I think this consideration of both the teacher's objectives and the learner's objectives is very important, because hopefully they come together. There's no point you wanting one thing, them wanting another. Nobody will learn anything. Here's another example of a local sign. This time, much more direct language. Only 2 customers in the shop at a time, and please wear your mask. And then something a bit softer, thank you. Now, none of these texts, none of these examples of use of language, of course, are going to be around in any textbook at the moment. They can't be. But these examples of real language being used in different places are, I think, quite interesting, because one of the things I would do with students in some of your contexts is to look at something like this from a street in a small town in Scotland and say, do we have anything like this in our town? Are there any signs like this? What are the differences? Are they more polite, less polite, more direct, etc., etc.? There's quite a lot of interesting language work, I think, and this is me looking ahead to the future, that I think I will want to use in the future using examples from now. So what we need to think about is what has changed and what is the same. So thinking about our objectives, before COVID, now and after COVID, were the objectives very exam-based? Were they based on helping your students to be able to do things? What were your objectives? And were they based on people being able to communicate together? Or are they now much more focused on helping the individual to use language in different contexts? And what are those contexts? 2 weeks ago, we were allowed to travel to some countries in Europe about 3 weeks ago, and I drove down through England to France to stay with some friends. It's quite a long drive through England on the motorway, and I stayed overnight in a hotel, which I often use. And I found this sign on a door in the hotel, which I found quite extraordinary in terms of language and also the message. Social distancing in corridors, the corridors that you have in a hotel. When passing in corridors, please face away from each other. And now that's an extraordinary message. You know, don't look, don't be in facial contact with anybody near you, but face away. And this is something, a bit of English that one would never have found before COVID. And in your objectives in teaching, what are your objectives? Have they changed? And what are your objectives going to be in the future? Very much worth thinking about. So looking ahead, we can ask ourselves what's going to change, how, why, where and when, etc. Another thing that I think I mentioned at the beginning about COVID is that it's international. I said I drove down through England to go to France, and this was in the terminal at the Eurotunnel in Calais, and notices in both English and French. Again, maintain your social distancing inside of the language, the lounge area. It's I think a rather strange use of, I may say, but the important thing is the message. All these signs, which I don't know about in your country, but here are popping up absolutely all over the place. It's get the message through, stop people doing stupid things, make sure that they respect what they've got to do, and respect other people, because the situation, the world that we all live in is different. It's changed. Okay, and this, I think, is a question to reflect on. What useful lessons have you learned from the current situation? Well, hopefully there are some useful ones. What have you learned from it? What have you learned about yourself as a teacher? You know, the things that you feel confident in doing, the things that you are very nervous about doing, the things that you've suddenly discovered, oh, I can do that quite well. I don't need to worry about it. And also, I think, what about your students? Have they grown in self-confidence, or are they actually more worried about things in general? And I think actually what is happening to us all makes us think realistically about the importance and the place of learning a language, in our case, English, you know, because it's in a context of people who are worried, people who are have lost their jobs, adults who are having to homeschool their kids and so on, certainly here. So I think all of us will have changed after this this experience. And I think in our selection of materials, our selection of activities to do, maybe we need to reflect a little bit about that. I think there's a tendency, I know I have it, of thinking of teachers and students, but actually we're all people. And I think that the great thing the COVID crisis is doing for us is making us focus on being people. So those were the very COVID focused things that came to my mind when I was thinking about this. And then I began thinking more broadly about teaching, about English and today, and the different contexts in which we teach and our students learn, and about our objectives. And it seems to me that one of the dangers, traps perhaps, as teachers of language is that we tend to focus, first of all, on the language. we worry about teaching the present perfect tense, or having to say something politely, disagree politely, and so on, or passing an exam. Our focus, those of us who've been trained to teach a language, has been very much on the language. And I think what is happening now is, because the world outside, our world and our students' worlds are changing so much, we need to think about the world outside. We need to think about how the changes that are happening there are having an effect on the language you use and personal relationships, communication, and therefore on the context in which we're teaching, the context in which in the future your students are going to be using the language. Are they going to be doing much more online, even when hopefully life gets back to normal? Are people who use English for business, are they going to be communicating much more with international colleagues online, or even more online? Are they also going to be relying very much on this, on phone calls rather than face to face? What else has changed in the use of English and the kind of English that is being used? So again, thinking about contexts and objectives is important. And another photograph, this time from France, expressing their rules in a sort of diagrammatical form. And I think, again, from the point of view of language and communication, it's quite useful to look at photos like this, and perhaps if you can go out, encourage your students to take some. You know, what is the message? What is the person who designed that particular message, that sign? What are they trying to get over? How have they used language? In this case, because it was in France, basically for French people, using the L1, not a foreign language, using that to communicate a message. And I think quite a lot of interesting stuff could be done looking at any signs like this in Portuguese or Spanish. And you, as native speakers of those languages, assessing, analysing how the language is being used. What was the message that people were trying to get over? Was it a friendly message, or was it a you must do this, you can't do that kind of message? And then see, you know, how would you express that in English? Not direct translation, but how would you get that message over? Because that brings in the whole area of intercultural, cross-cultural communication, sort of understanding behavior patterns, which those of you who know me will know something I think very important. So the sort of questions I think we can be asking ourselves over the next couple of months, few months, is what about the language we're teaching? Is it the same or is it different? Bits of vocabulary. I keep going on about social distancing. You know, I'm learning new bits of English, which I've never seen used in that way. You know, that's quite interesting. When we talk about the world outside, well, you know, the kind of world that is expressed in normal course books. You know, it's the Underground in London, or if it's Scotland, it'll be Edinburgh Castle or something. Well, which world? I think what we're all going to be doing is focusing much more on our very local world, because we've had to either be on our own or only with a member of our family, or I think now we're allowed to meet 5 people, not of our family, but only outside in the street or the garden, and so on. What do we mean by the world? What do I mean by my world? And I look at my world in a different way from I did 6 months ago. And people, us, have we changed? And I said, I think I've probably changed a bit. I think I look and listen to people, and I've got more used to being on my own. This is something, again, those of you who know me will probably have heard me say in the past. I was looking at one of the curriculum reform documents. This is from about 15 years ago, from the Brazilian Ministry of Education. And I found this statement, which I've quoted a lot: the learner is the starting point. If you're teaching English, the learner is the starting point. If you're teaching mathematics, the learner is the starting point. If you're teaching science, the learner is the starting point. I think it's something that as teachers we often forget, and certainly examiners often forget. And I've quoted this a lot and tried to follow that when I've been writing things. But I think now the learner is the starting point, but so is the context in which we're living, teaching, learning, and our reality, because our reality for ourselves and our students has changed. And I've said, and these can and do change. So these are the kind of thoughts that have come to my mind over the last couple of months when I've been thinking about teaching English. And when I was thinking about this talk, I thought of using a diagram, which again, those of you who know me may well have seen before. It's something I find very useful. It places teachers and learners within the context of education. It might be a private language school, it might be state education, it might be something else. But teachers and learners are operating within an educational context, but that educational context is also in the context of the world outside, which is affected by political change, economic change, and so on and so forth. You know, suddenly a language like English becomes the first language that is learnt in school because of political change, or it won't be, may change again. And I think when I've been using this diagram in the past, I've focused very much on the green and the blue, on the teachers and learners and the educational context. But now I think suddenly, I think it's this bit that I think I need to think about in terms of what should we be teaching, how could we be teaching, and what will be useful for our students in the future and ourselves. There's again a reminder about getting this message over in English and English and French. And that made me start thinking about learning materials. Now, as Marcia said at the beginning, I've been involved, I've been lucky enough to be involved on both sides of producing materials, both as somebody who writes them and as an editor, publisher who looks at things that other people have written and, you know, helps to push them in a different direction. So I've thought a lot about learning materials, whether it's textbook or digital, over the years. And it seems to me, and I don't think much has changed for me, but the question is there for you, has anything changed? I think all learning materials should encourage learner independence. We're teaching a class, but we're actually teaching 10, 15, 20, 30 individuals. Each of those individuals has, we hope, some personal skills. Certainly they will have personal skills. And I think as a teacher, we need to help develop those personal skills, and we need learning materials, teaching materials that can help us do that. And I think the best way good materials can do that is to bridge the gap between the classroom and the learner's own worlds. And the tricky thing, of course, now, and very much for publishers now, is that the learner's own world has changed from what it was a year ago. So, you know, I'm sure there are a lot of very worried discussions going on about updating material and so on. But you need to be quite critical and think, is that just surface, or are the materials really doing what I want for my learners? And the other thing, I think, when we're choosing material or selecting activities to use with our students, is to think about the skills that are needed. I mean, obviously language skills, although people sometimes talk about language skills and I'm not quite sure what they mean. I mean, is it pronunciation? Is it grammar? Is it wide vocabulary? Is it flexibility? Is it the ability to communicate with different people in different registers? You know, language is such a complex and rich word. Life skills, the idea that you can adapt as you go on and you can use the language and your behavior in that language at different stages of your life in different contexts. Communication skills, I've talked about, I talk about a lot. How do we communicate with people from other cultures, other backgrounds, in other contexts, using different media? I mean, you are listening to a small face that you can see on a computer screen, and I'm talking to people who may be anywhere, whom I can't see. Communication is so much through facial expression, language, body language, and so on. There's also the cultural awareness aspect of it. What is appropriate behavior to use in different situations, different nationalities? I have a problem, having lived in France and Italy a lot. I tend to shake hands with people I don't know when I meet them for the first time. I had an example this morning. I had to do something out in the town, and I was introduced to there's a problem with flooding in our town. And I was introduced to an engineer who'd come, nothing to do with language teaching. And my immediate reaction when I met this man whom I'd never met before was to hold out my hands to shake it. Well, for one thing, you're not allowed to touch anybody because of COVID. And secondly, British people on the whole don't shake hands. So, you know, cultural awareness and behavior, those of you who know me will know something I talk about a lot. But thinking about the skills that your learners are going to need is, I think, important. And I think one thing this change in our reality has taught me is to think, you know, how we make personal choices and personal decisions. Something as simple as, can I go to the shops? Can I go to the supermarket? If I go to the supermarket in Scotland, but not England, I have to wear my mask. And it's interesting that actually most people do. In English, they've just, well, they've introduced some stupid suggestion that it would be a good idea to wear your mask indoors if you can, or something like that. It's much easier. In Scotland, you have to. Sometimes rules are quite a good thing. Now, I talked about changing reality, and this is the way my office reality changed in March. That was at a time when we weren't allowed to mix with anybody else. We couldn't meet anybody else. The weather for Scotland became quite good. So I decided that my office would be in my garden and that my new reality would be working on my laptop. Luckily, there is a Wi-Fi link even from the garden. It was helped by a glass of wine, I may say, for not at all hours of day and night. But I suddenly got used to working in a different environment rather than from this office where I'm sitting at the moment. And it was quite interesting because suddenly I was in a garden, and because traffic, there was very, very little traffic. It was wonderful. I mean, unfortunately, it's all come back again, or is coming back. But there was a lot of silence, which for thinking, I was writing something, for thinking was wonderful. But it wasn't, it was silence from people and from traffic. But I suddenly became more and more aware of the sound of birds, the number of birds, and it was spring, so the birds tend to make a lot of noise and jump around and so on. And I began noticing things in the garden, and I've lived in this house for 20 years, so I know it very well. But I realized I was beginning to notice things that I hadn't noticed over the past. And I think, going back to personal choices, decisions, change, I'm sure all of us are going through that. We're changing ourselves. I then began to think more about some of the things that Vinny and I had put in the Teaching English Today book. This book, I may say, it's got a long history. It may be Teaching English Today, but it began way back before I'd ever met Vinny. I did a version of this that SBS asked me to do in the 90s. And it's gone through 4 or 5 different versions for different countries and so on. And what's been very good for me is it's forced me to go back and ask myself, Susan, what do you mean by teaching? What does English mean? What place does it have in the world now? And what is today? So I've been forced to think about things really over the years. And what I thought I'd do is spend a little bit more time on the whole question of choosing material, because I know, talking to friends and colleagues here who are teachers, one of the things that they've said is, but Susan, suddenly I can't go to my class. I'm not going to the school to teach. I have to do it all from home. What material do I use? Okay, there's a lot of good digital material and awful digital material available, but how do I choose what is right for my teaching situation, which for some of these friends is the kitchen table and their laptop, in some a more formal thing. What should I be looking at when I choose material? And I thought about it and I said, well, it's no different from when you were choosing material before to use with your class, the course book and so on. And they said, no, don't believe it. And so I said, well, let's think about what we need to do when we're choosing material. And then you tell me at the end whether digital material is any different from old style print material. First of all, I think we should ask ourselves, what's its purpose? How can I use it? What format is it? Is it a course book with lots of bits and pieces? Is it a reader? Is it a digital program? What choice do we have? And can we change it? Or if we make a choice, are we stuck with it for several years? So I certainly, when I'm training teachers, I ask this question: what factors affect your course of material, your choice of material? And I ask the question, where do you start? And mostly they say, well, the material, of course. If we're in an exhibition where there's a conference where there's a book exhibition, or if you can go to an SBS bookshop, you look at the material. And if I know the group well, I say, no, that's the last place to start. What you need to do when you're choosing material is the context, who the learners are, your objectives, your resources. I've seen people choosing textbook series which are wonderful, but totally inappropriate for their teaching situation, and yourself, because I think any material is very, very personal. That's another sign. And how does it fit your contexts and objectives? And an interesting thing to do on a training course or in a teaching situation is to decide your criteria for choosing material. What do you look for when you want to decide this course or that course, this reader or that reader? Decide your criteria, make a list, apply them to a bit of material, and then if you're on a training course, 2 people can use the same bit of material to apply their criteria to, or you can do it with a colleague you're working with, and discuss how the points are the same and which are different. What is positive for you, maybe negative for your friend, and discuss the reasons. And an interesting thing that comes out of this very often is that it's personal teaching style, personal likes and dislikes, and type of students, very subjective personal things that actually are most effective in helping us to find and choose good material. And one of the things I very often ask people, are there any other useful suggestions or criteria? And something that came out in a course I was doing earlier in the year was, well, what about learner input? What space is there in the material for the learners to inject their own ideas, their own questions, their own adaptations? And I thought a lot about this. There's another example of a sign. Our indoor seating will remain at over 2 meters apart. Interesting, we're in Scotland, but meters are spelt in American English. Health and safety is priority. I think it should be a priority or our priority. Again, I don't know if it happens. My Portuguese and Spanish are not good enough. I haven't noticed whether there are lots of language mistakes in the sort of notices people put out in your environments. There certainly are in English in Britain. So learner input, why? Well, above all, building up learner self-confidence and adaptability, I think. And thinking about typical coursebook progression of activities, very often an activity in a unit is a focus task. The students are asked to look or read or listen to something. Then they're asked to answer questions. And then you go on to the next activity. I'm oversimplifying, obviously, and they're not all like that. But I think what's important is that there's space in an activity or a series of activities for learner input, learner experimentation, because this all helps to build up self-confidence. And if, as most course books do, most course material does, has photos, photos are usually of people, well, unless it's a landscape. People, you can have a look at them, you can speculate about them, you can discuss them, and you can ask questions like, well, who are they? What's the relationship between the people in the photo? Why are they there? What do you think they're feeling before they produce their conversation, dialogue, and so on? There's another sign. And, sorry, didn't need to go back. If you really use the photo, you can encourage your students to select bits of language that are appropriate to the people. You can encourage them to try it out and experiment and adapt and improvise and do lots of things which really involve them in using the language. And you can do this just as well online, or almost as well online, or maybe in a different way, as you can in a class. That the individual student, or if you're able to have two people working together in a sort of Zoom room, they can actually be doing this as a pair work activity. And this is an example, I find it's from an old example from the Encounters book series that I wrote for Brazil 4 or 5 years ago. Now, that was is a series, I think it still exists. It's a series for service English learners. So people who are working in shopping malls, waiters, taxi drivers, and so on, who are going to suddenly, because of the World Cup at that time, suddenly going to have to cope with foreigners, people like me, who not only present language problems, but also behavior problems. And because I was doing some consultancy work with Macmillan do Brasil at the time, I extended my trips by a few days, and I spent a lot of time just listening with a notebook. I felt I couldn't take photos, but with a notebook, listening and watching to how foreigners were interacting with service personnel. And this is based on something that I observed in a hotel in Sao Paulo. And the conversation, which is a very typical textbook conversation, I think, giving and responding to complaints. Visitor one says, "Excuse me, The local person, that's what LP means, says, yes, the waiter, we want to order. Yes, what do you want? Well, we want to see the menu. Oh, I'm sorry. No, don't go away. We want to order some drinks now. Oh, yes, of course. What would you like? 2 glasses of red wine. Can I see the wine list? I'm afraid we don't have glasses. A bottle? No, I don't want a bottle. Look, this is ridiculous. I'm sorry. We're very busy tonight. Come on, let's go somewhere else. This is an awful place. Now, that is a simplification in terms of the actual language used of a real situation. I was horrified at these 2 visitors who were so rude to the poor waiter. But it's an example that actually you can use by perhaps spending more time on the photo and giving your students the possibility of making up their own dialogue, having decided the relationship between the 2 people, the waiter, how does a waiter feel? Has anybody ever worked as a waiter? It's very tiring. I used to do it as a student in holidays, and you get an ache in your back for some, I'm not quite sure why, but you do, or I did. But, the behavior aspect, the cultural awareness aspect is something that you can, in a sense, get out of the most normal textbook dialogue. So that, in terms of use of material, is something that in this COVID situation, I think maybe is worth thinking about. The other aspect of learner self-confidence I wanted to think about briefly, my eye on the time, is learner production. How can you help your learners actually produce things? And project work is, again, something I've been very involved in over the years. I like doing, because I think it brings out personal skills, which are very often not language skills. They might be organizational skills, they might be artistic skills, digital skills. Projects, I think, are interesting, but the problem I've always found when I say projects to teachers is a lot of them look absolutely aghast and nervous and say, oh, Susan, they're so difficult to organize. And that word organization, I think, if you're doing a project online, which you could certainly do now with digital teaching, because you could ask your students to be researching things on the internet and then constructing something and presenting it themselves. So projects, I think, are something to think about in terms of your own learners and teaching situations at the moment. The key thing about them is organization. And one of the things I was involved with 2 years ago was a course for students, teenage students coming to the UK to do summer courses. And because they were in the UK, they were obviously in an environment where they could go and discover things, take photos, talk to people, try food, and so on. And what we wanted them to do was every day in the week, over a 2-week period, we wanted them to work with a group, go and find out things, which you could do online rather than for real, and working with their group, construct a project to present to the rest of the course. And what we decided, I didn't write the student material, but I wrote most of the teachers' material. We felt that the organization was very important, so that stage 1, getting started, involved organizing and planning. Asking questions will be like, who'll be in the group? What will each person be doing? What are you good at? What do you like doing? And that every day during the project project development, they were building up the working together, finding out when things go wrong, because projects things do go wrong very often. What do we do about it? We've got a problem. we wanted to take photographs here, and the person said we couldn't take a photograph of his house or something like that. I was researching something online. I couldn't find the link. It didn't work. It wasn't appropriate. I couldn't understand it, and so on. And stage 3 focused on working together. And then if you're doing a project, you've got to organize it. You've got to put the various bits together. It's a bit like writing a course book. You've got to share it with others. So you've got to present it. Now, how do you present a project? You can do it online. How do we present it? Does it need a lot of illustration, a lot of text? Does it need a voiceover? A lot of discussion going on. Probably, realistically, in L1, in your case is either Portuguese or Spanish, but it doesn't matter, because it's the organizing, the thinking, the learner input into the activity that for me is important. And then I think very important, if students have produced something, whether it's a little play or whether it's an online presentation or a poster, it's very, very important that you and they have time to think about it, analyze what went right, what went wrong, what would we do differently another time, how would we advise another group to do this project better, and what do we really feel quite proud about. And I think this sort of analytical thinking, using a project as a basis for analytical thinking, goes back to what I was saying, and somebody put up on the chat thing about the life skills thing. You know, that is developing your life skills to be analytical, critical, realize when you have made a mistake and could do something better. So we're almost getting to the end. What about you? Learner production, I've talked about. What about teacher production? Have you produced any material? And this could be articles, blogs, online, or for publication, if you want to write a reader or get involved in a course book. And I think the same questions arise, for any of us who are writing things. And it can be as simple as a blog, or it's something much more ambitious. We have to think about the person who's on the receiving end. I think when if I remember back to the very first time when I started writing, which was a long, long time ago, I started writing readers because I thought the readers, I was teaching in Italy, and the readers we had then, I thought they were awful. And I met an editor from a British publishing company, and I was all of 22, 23 years old, so I knew it all. And I told him how dreadful the readers were, because they were all fictional stories, and none of my students were interested in this. And he's a very sensible man. He said, well, if you think they're bad, why don't you write one? And I thought, oh, yes. And I did, and it was probably pretty awful. And he was a very nice person. He sent it back with comments. And I met him years later, and I apologized for being so big-headed. And he said, no, I knew you would either accept and rewrite, or that would be it. You'd never write anything again. And, I took his advice, questions, and the advice was, think about who you're writing for. Have a vision of somebody. I mean, I find, and I do it when I'm preparing a talk too, I sort of have a vision of a person or people whom I'm talking to. So at this moment, I'm not talking to my screen. I'm pretending there are, well, I hope there are some people there. And I think that's important when you're writing things. So again, the learner is the starting point, much what I've just been saying. And obviously these will change. And thinking more broadly takes me back to skills. I don't think these have changed over the years. I mean, I think if I'd been talking to you 2 years ago, I would have said language skills are important, life skills are important, Communication skills, very, very important, whatever we mean by that, and different in different contexts. It's a very interesting area to explore. And cultural awareness, the one that I think is probably more important than anything. But now, because things are changing so much for all of us, flexibility is really, really important. You know, we have to be prepared to do anything in a situation which we've never met before. So learning materials, I think, whatever type they are, online, digital, print, photos, they should encourage learner independence. They recognize and develop personal skills and bridge the gap between the classroom and the learner's own worlds. And some materials you've got, I'm sure, do that well, but others you're going to have to push in a particular direction to link up with the learner's realities. And the more you know about, you can understand about your learner's realities, the better. And in a funny way, because of this COVID crisis, it's put us all into very much the same position. Obviously, some people are struggling financially, economically, big families, it's difficult. But suddenly we've all had to think about what our reality is. So the COVID crisis, I think, worldwide effect. The references of material I've used when I'm thinking about this, the photo and the bad-tempered text conversation came from Encounters English Here and Now. The course for UK students, Dive In, the project work was published by Klett, the German publisher, now working as Delta Publishing. And Teaching English Today, Context and Objectives, Susan Holden and Vinnie Nobre. And just to remind you, that's what it looks like. And that's its Portuguese version. Another reminder. And this is quite interesting. Face marks on sale here. Contributions from all sales to NHS charities. NHS is the National Health Service in Britain. And there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, the crisis that they've had to cope with, how good they've been doing it with it, and so on. So there's a lot of attempt to raise money for them. Another reminder of the changing contexts. And finally, a photo which I may have used in Brazil last year. It's the river by the side of my garden. It's 2 swans and 3 cygnets, little swans. And I think for me, it sums up what good teaching should be. The 2 swans are the teachers. They're the adults. They're not interfering with the young ones, the students, but they're keeping an eye on them. They're in an environment which it was a nice sunny day there, but it can change from one minute to another. And I think as teachers, that's what we need to be doing in our relationship with our learners. We don't interfere, but we keep an eye on them. We understand the context and hopefully help them to do better and have a bit of good luck. So I wanted to end up with the date, 30th of July 2020, and I would say 30th of July 2021. I would love to think I would be in Brazil or Peru, but who knows? Okay, thank you very much for coming, and I wish you a lot of luck over the next 2.5 days and with your teaching. Thank you very much.